Caroline Foster, and I'm the Executive Director of the French American Foundation in the US. I have the pleasure of welcoming you to a very special webinar this afternoon. For those of you joining us for the first time, the French American Foundation's webinar series is an opportunity to engage our broader community in a dialogue on topics of mutual interest for both sides of the Atlantic. Today, we have the immense pleasure of having William Drozdiak to discuss his new book, The Last President of Europe, Emmanuel Macron's Race to Revive Europe and Save the World. The discussion will be led by Ambassador James Lowenstein, co-founder of the French American Foundation. I will leave the privilege to Jim to introduce William Drozdiak in details, but I'm honored to say a few words about Jim himself. As I mentioned, Jim Lowenstein was the co-founder with late Professor Nicolas Wall of the French American Foundation in Paris and New York, and is the honorary co-chairman of the French American Foundation in the US. If you would like to learn a little more about the early history of the French American Foundation, we have some notes written by Jim Lowenstein himself on our website. I engage you to have a look at what is our purpose and why do we do this. Jim was a career diplomat whose service began in Paris with the Marshall Plan in 1950, was then interrupted by 3 years as a naval officer and continued thereafter with service in Eastern Europe and Asia, and finally as ambassador to Luxembourg. He is a life member of the Council of Foreign Relations and an officer of the Legion of Honor. Questions will be taken in the Q&A section and chat comments, and they will be read when we arrive to the Q&A part of this webinar. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Jim Lowenstein. Thank you so much again for being with us today.
Thank you. Do I have to push anything or do I just come up?
Oh, you're here.
Am I on?
Yes, you're on.
Okay, I can't see myself. Well, thank you, Emmeline, and incidentally, happy birthday. It is a great pleasure to introduce Bill Drozdiak and this wonderful book that he's written, which I urge all of you to get. Bill is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution's Center on the United States and Europe. Sorry about that. And a senior advisor at McLarty Associates in Washington. For 10 years, he served as president of the American Council on Germany, where he expanded their Young Leaders program. What a good idea. And previously, he was the founding executive director of the Transatlantic Center in Brussels, created by the German Marshall Fund as a think tank for US-European relations. Before that, Bill spent 2 decades as a senior editor and foreign correspondent for the Washington Post. He was the Post's bureau chief in Paris and Berlin and chief European correspondent in Brussels. Before joining the Post, he was the State Department correspondent for Time and was based in Cairo and Beirut. He is a graduate of the University of Oregon and has a master's degree in economics from the Collège de l'Europe in Bruges. He is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. But never mind all that. For 7 years before becoming a journalist, he played professional basketball in Europe and the United States. And so, Bill, let me pass the ball to you and ask the first question: why the title of the book?
Well, thank you very much, Jim, and to Emmeline and my friends at the French American Foundation for hosting this. The title, The Last President of Europe, really came out of a series of conversations I had with Emmanuel Macron over the last couple of years, which led to my writing this book. And I was captivated by the notion that here was this political novice, never having been elected to any political office before, who ascends to the French presidency and immediately sets this Herculean agenda for himself to modernize France, to reinvigorate Europe, and to reshape the world order. So the last 2 years I've been following closely the arc of his presidency, the ups and downs, and in particular focusing on a lot of his foreign policy, because he is really something of a self-taught autodidact in foreign policy. I looked everywhere. He never had really a mentor. And so he really came to the conviction that by modernizing France, he would be able to put France back in a leadership role with Germany to try and revive the European project. And also at a time when the world order was going through these convulsions with the United States retreating from its global leadership role, and Russia coming back as a resurgent aggressive power, and the rise of China, of course. So in this new big power rivalry, Macron feared that Europe could disappear, that was the word he used with me, unless it adapted and became a stronger power. So I was struck by the fact that he's had such difficulty over the last 2.5 years in persuading first Chancellor Merkel of Germany and the other leaders of Europe to take bold initiatives to reinvigorate Europe. And I came to the conviction that really it could be a tragedy for Europe, because if he fails, he's really the last leader that I've come to know who really reflects the visions and values of the founding fathers of the European Union, led by Jean Monnet, who believed that Europe should become an integrated political community and not just an economic single market. And Macron strongly believes in this vision. And I thought I end the book by saying it would be a tragedy if, for the first time when France is led by a strongly pro-European visionary, that the other European leaders do not join him in moving toward a more unified Europe. So that's why the title is The Last President of Europe, sort of a cautionary warning that if Macron fails, this could be very take all of Europe into a bad strait.
You spent a lot of time with him. Before we get to issues, what was he like?
Well, he's a very disciplined man. It comes across in public as rather glacial, arrogant, aloof, but he can be very engaging in private conversation. He's extremely well read. He really does have a literary, even philosophical bent to him. And I think that once you get to know him, you can see that he has an inner charm that he tries to use. Other writers like Emmanuel Carrère, who is a French novelist who spent a week traveling with Macron, came away bedazzled by his charm, saying this man could seduce a chair and if he walks into a room. And I didn't get that impression so much, but I think it's striking that the private side of Macron is at such odds with the public perception. People who he is criticized as being président des riches, when he's tried to shake up the economy. He's made some blunders. He's admitted that himself. I think that's due largely to his inexperience in politics. But the fact that he has made progress in areas where other French presidents have failed is significant. And I think for me, as an American author and journalist covering him, I'm most interested in how he wants to transform France and Europe on the world stage. And that's why I thought I'd focus in a large section of the book on his policies in Europe and toward the world at large.
Things were coming along well until the Yellow Vest movement suddenly exploded. Could anyone have seen this coming, do you think?
I thought he was, the first signs where it was evident was shortly before the World War I centennial commemorations, which were in November of 2018. Macron went on a tour of around the country of the famous battle sites, and he was met with a lot of caustic vitriol from the public who were shouting at him to do more. And I thought it showed how the Parisian elite, including him, had become so removed from the countryside, and this rural metropolitan divide was something that finally exploded with a just a very minor increase in taxes on gasoline that was intended to encourage people to move toward vehicles that would emit less carbon. And it backfired in a spectacular way, and it led to these demonstrations that really showed, that took on a personal aspect. And I remember there was one trip he made to the French countryside, I think it was in December of 2018, where he was really vilified. People were spitting on him and shouting obscenities at him, and he came back to the Elysee really in a state of shock. And it was at that point he retreated behind the Elysee, because even his security guards were worried about his safety if he went out in public anymore. So for about 3 weeks, he holed up in the Elysee and tried to figure his way out. And that's when he came up with this idea of le grand débat national, which became a series of town hall meetings around France that helped revive his presidency at a time when it looked like he might be forced from power.
Before we can leave the strictly domestic issues and move to the larger area of Europe, I was struck by the fact that you said in your book that in his first year in office, he visited 27 countries. That showed a real interest in making sure that he didn't get totally consumed by domestic politics.
Yeah, and I think that may have hurt his standing. A lot of people in France grumbled, well, he was supposed to modernize France, he should spend more time here. But of course, in the French power hierarchy, the president is the personification of the foreign and security policy. But also, I think he really wanted to get to know and understand the world. And the way that I saw him come to understand foreign issues was meeting in person with other leaders. And that's why the last part of my book, when I describe the world, I focus on his personal relationships with Donald Trump in one chapter, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and then we have a final conversation about the state of geopolitics and what he thinks the world will be like 30 years from now.
Before we turn to Trump and Putin, would you say something about the special relationship with Merkel?
Yes, I mean, this is really the key. The French-German tandem has been malfunctioning for quite a number of years now. I think this has been the vital driving force for decades behind the European Union. We saw it with the positive relationship between Adenauer and de Gaulle, between Schmidt and Giscard d'Estaing, and finally with Helmut Kohl and Francois Mitterrand. And in both cases, it was interesting. In case of Kohl being Christian Democrat, a conservative leader, Mitterrand, a paragon of socialism, they were able to represent a wide spectrum of views across Europe. And that's why they were able to lead the other member states toward bold and dramatic new policies, including the creation of the euro. But that has stalled somewhat. I've talked with Angela Merkel in the past because I was based in Germany for a number of years for the Washington Post. And she was frustrated in her relationships with President Sarkozy and President Hollande because they seemed incapable of making the necessary modernization of France that would equalize the power balance with Germany. And along came Macron, who was determined to do this, to succeed in the way that his predecessors had failed. He made a point of his first act in office after appointing a prime minister was to go to Berlin to meet with Chancellor Merkel. He appointed a cabinet made up of German speakers who understood Germany, and he really pressed Angela Merkel, saying, "You will be surprised by what we do in France. This time we're going to succeed, and I want you to join me making, leading Europe to a new stage of an integrated political community." And I think what transpired over the last couple of years was a series of frustrating disappointments for him that Angela Merkel, given to her innate caution, was reluctant to make this jump toward Europe. And it boiled over in several of the conversations that I became aware of, that she felt she could not, she was constrained by her political allies from doing this. And Macron tried to persuade her otherwise, but did not succeed. And when I talked with my contacts in Germany, including Wolfgang Schäuble and many others, it was interesting. I came to realize that Merkel, having grown up in the East, did not have the visceral understanding of the importance of French-German reconciliation after World War II. For 5 centuries, every generation of French and Germans were either preparing to go to war or were at war with each other. And this meant a lot to chancellors like Helmut Kohl, whom, when I interviewed him in 1985, took me to his backyard and pointed in the distance to France, and then to the ground in his backyard. He says, "I'm convinced that the blood of French and German soldiers is mixed in the ground here on my property, and I'm determined never to see that happen again." Well, Merkel, having grown up on the other side of the wall, did not have this personal connection to it. And I think that explains a lot for her rather passive views on Europe. Now, that has changed dramatically in the last month or so because of the crisis posed by the pandemic. And I think the French-German initiative that is driving the European Union toward a huge more than $1 trillion recovery fund, the fact that she finally changed her mind and has come around to Macron's perspective was driven by the realization that Germany could actually witness the collapse of the European Union, and this would be suicidal for Germany's own economic interests. And for that reason, I think that's caused a great change of heart, not just in Merkel, but among the political class in Germany. And I'm hopeful that this optimism will continue.
Incidentally, you notice in your book that Merkel is the same age as Brigitte Macron, which
That's right, 24 years older than Emmanuel.
This leads me to the question of any observations on the role that Brigitte plays in the president's life, and what kind of advice she gives him, what her interests are, and so forth.
I think she plays a political advisory role. Certainly during the campaigns, she was a very popular figure, and I think will play a prominent role in any re-election effort. In terms of foreign policy, I don't think she gets involved so much, but she clearly has a great interest in culture, in education. She's been very much involved in picking the people within the cabinet who are advising Macron in these issues. Just within the Élysée, she's transformed the decor. There's much more modern, avant-garde type of art covering the walls of the Élysée than I had seen in the past when I would visit other presidents there. So she's had that impact on it. And of course, the fact that she had been his high school drama teacher, which is how they met when he was an adolescent student of hers. This is, they share a passion for literature and the theater.
Let's pass to Macron's relationship with Trump, which you talk about in the book, and his relationship to Putin. Let's take Trump first.
Yeah. With Trump, it was interesting. I mean, he made a clear effort, more than any other European leader, to try and establish a dialogue with Trump. Merkel can't stand being in the same room with him, and so she was happy to say, if you want to be the Trump whisperer for Europe, that's fine with me. And but Macron said we can't just ignore him, because this is, after all, is the United States, and it's France's oldest and most important ally. And initially he said, even though in terms of temperament, they're dramatically different. Trump being a businessman, a deal maker, Macron more philosophical, also being 30 years younger. But he was quick to point out to, in his first meetings with Trump, that look, we share a number of things in common. We're both political mavericks. We disrupted the political establishment in gaining power. And we both believe that the private sector can work in tandem with government for the betterment of the people. But Trump's erratic nature has been so difficult to deal with that has caused Macron endless amount of frustration. I mean, it boiled over when he pulled out, when Trump decided to pull out American forces from northern Syria and leaving Kurdish allies in the lurch, but also several hundred French special forces whose lives were jeopardized by this. And this outraged Macron, and that led to a comment. He says, what good is NATO for? And that's when he called NATO brain dead if there's no coordination of policy going on between the United States and its most important allies.
What about the relationship with Putin?
And Putin, I think he's taken a somewhat controversial stand in believing that Putin and Russia are absolutely essential to any long-term security partnership and stability for Europe. And he acknowledges this is a challenge that will extend well beyond Putin's term in power. He said maybe 20, 30 years, but eventually Europe has to establish a more stable and secure partnership with Russia. His belief was that I would say that Putin is a creature of the KGB, which is his background. Macron's response was, he's first and foremost, the son of St. Petersburg. And St. Petersburg's culture and history is part of the West. And so he said, that's why I never fail to mention names like Dostoevsky and Pushkin and Peter the Great whenever I meet with Putin, to remind him of this tug of war within Russian culture between moving toward Europe and also toward the East. But he said he tried time and time again to persuade Putin that Russia's strategic interest lies with a closer relationship with the West, with France, but also the European Union and even the United States. Because looked at from Moscow, the biggest challenges are the encroachment of China on Russia's eastern frontier, which is happening because they don't have border guards to defend their eastern Siberian front, and Chinese populations are moving in. And then Islamic radicalism threatening Russia from the south. So you would think this would be a terrible time for a Russian leader to pick a fight with the West. But Putin has done so largely in the belief that he can drive a sense of Russian nationalism and pride that will boost his standing. It's worked until recently, but now there are signs that his standing is deteriorating fast.
Well, do you think that the fact that Macron has had a hard time with Trump has driven him into a closer relationship with Putin?
No, I think this is, he's looking at Europe's security needs over the long term. I think he's convinced that the United States is turning away from Europe, and that this is a function 70 years after World War II, that he said this, whether you like it or not, this seems to be happening, and it predates the Trump era. It was already happening under President Obama's administration when he announced a pivot toward Asia. And so that's why he's been trying to wake up other European leaders, saying Europe needs to take control of its own destiny. Merkel has used that phrase as well, but hasn't really done much in terms of assuming a greater share of the burden. So I think while recognizing that the United States is not going to be so attentive to Europe's security needs, he needs to look to the East and find some kind of a new understanding and partnership with Russia, to make Russia understand that it's in Russia's own interests to have a more secure and stable partnership with Europe. And at some point, I think the next leader of Russia may be ready to embrace that kind of position.
Well, the next leader of Russia isn't going to show up for a while, is he? I mean, Putin.
Well, we'll see. I mean, it's yeah, you're right. But Putin is trying to extend his term in office until 2036. Yeah. But I get my impression, and a number of friends who are experts in Russia say that this kind of autocracy leadership is something that seems to be entrenched and immovable until suddenly it isn't, and it breaks suddenly. So we'll see. I would not bet that he will be in office in 2036, 16 years from now.
You say a few words about Macron Africa. I know this is one of his strong interests.
Right. Well, it was interesting. We were, one of our last conversation, we were talking about the state of the world or geopolitics. And of course, he often turns the tables on his questioner and says, what for you was the transforming experience? And I said, well, my career as a journalist, and I'm 30 years older than you, was the fall of the Berlin Wall and later on the rise of China. And I said, what do you think the world will look like when you're my age 30 years from now? And he said, I think the most dramatic event of the next 3 decades in my lifetime will be the spectacular transformation of Africa. And he's come to believe that that particularly the liberation of women in Africa can spark an entrepreneurial revolution that will help change the fortunes of this poor continent. And he's already acted on this. He sent a number of his most trusted diplomats to be ambassadors there and trying to conceive of a long-term Africa strategy going well beyond France's former colonies and its territorial influence in North Africa and West Africa, but across the entire continent. So it was interesting to hear him speak, and he's read up on a number of experts about this. And I think what is driving is, again, this is reflective of his philosophical bent. He cited the French historian Fernand Braudel, who wrote these masterful volumes about the Mediterranean. And Braudel's point was that at an earlier time in history, Europe and Africa came together and helped add this amazing civilization, and the flows of people and culture and wealth across the Mediterranean was a very natural state. And I think he has in his mind that at some point in the future, this Brodel's vision could be recreated.
Let's get back to these two initiatives of Macron's. First of all, the French-German initiative for European recovery, the coronavirus reaction. And secondly, the European Reform Initiative.
Yes, I think both of them are related. Again, this is, he believes that Europe has been sleepwalking for a number of years as the world order has been transformed, and that unless it starts taking dramatic steps, it could be picked apart by Russia, by China, by the United States at a point in the future that would lead to the breakup of the European Union. I have one chapter called Europe in Pieces, which describes how this fracturing of the European continent has taken place. And we now see a divide between North and South, the northern countries led by Germany and the Netherlands, who tend to be wealthy creditor countries, and the poorer southern partners, Spain, Italy, Greece, who have become deeply indebted and are having a hard time establishing economic growth that could offer some hope for a new generation. And then you have the East-West divide, authoritarian governments in Poland and Hungary seeming to spurn the democratic values of the European Union at a time when they are collecting enormous subsidies from the EU. And it's frustrating for leaders like Macron, who realize that they're taking EU money, disparaging EU policies and values, and cozying up to other autocracies, dictators in Russia and China, and preventing Europe from having a cohesive and coherent strategy toward the rest of the world. So I think this was all behind when he finally he said, we cannot do this on our own. As president of France, I need to have Germany on my side. And by persuading Angela Merkel to back this initiative, he's hopeful that he can alleviate this division between the wealthy creditors in the north and poorer countries in the south. But this is going to come to a head tomorrow. In fact, there's an EU teleconference summit that will start the negotiations on this, but it's going to be very tough because there are the so-called frugal four nations of the Netherlands, Austria, Sweden, and Denmark that have rejected offering grants to southern countries. They say these have to be repaid, and Macron and others have made the argument you can't keep piling debt on these countries, otherwise they're just going to collapse from it. And it's only Germany that has changed its mind when it realized its export markets were going to collapse if these policies continue.
What about the corona? I mean, obviously your book didn't deal with corona because corona happened after the book was published. But how do you think this coronavirus crisis will affect French politics and Macron's future?
Well, it's France's economy is going to shrink by 10 or 11% this year, which is going to be an enormous challenge for the president and his government to try and cope with this. I think he's managed first the lockdown and the gradual emergence, the deconfinement fairly well, but making sure that the economy gets relaunched again is going to be extremely difficult, and it's probably going to take several years. And whether or not he shows enough progress by the time of the French presidential elections 2 years from now is really open to question. It's just too hard to predict where things will stand then. But But certainly this is an enormous challenge, not just for Europe, but the United States and other parts of the world. But I think Macron wants to use this crisis as a way, just as he has persuaded Merkel, that he can convince other European leaders that they need to act together, or the whole enterprise of the European Union could fall apart. And so far, there at least he's making some progress on this. And at the same time, you have the whole issue of Brexit hanging over everyone's head, so which has not been resolved. And if we end up with a hard exit, Brexit with no deal, then that's going to also cause further economic hardship. So it's really up to these leaders to understand the enormity of the stakes that are now at hand. And Macron has talked himself hoarse in trying to plead. He's in London today. It'll be interesting to see what kind of conversations he has with Boris Johnson on this. But if there is going to be some kind of a trade arrangement, a deal between the European Union and Britain before the end of the year, that would be an optimistic note for both the European and the British economy.
His public opinion ratings remain low, including how he's treated the coronavirus. Why do you think he is unable to establish more contact with the French people? I mean, it worked after the grand debate, but briefly, but then it went back. Then his public opinion ratings sunk again to very low levels.
Yeah, I think he first came into office and cultivating this notion that of Jupiter, that he would stay above the fray. But I think he is temperamentally incapable of that. He is a micromanager at heart. He sleeps very little. He's worrying over every aspect. And rather than in the past, French presidents would like Mitterrand would disappear for a few days when they were under a lot of criticism from at home, and his staff would tell the French public, "Oh, he's off thinking great thoughts about how to lead France," and they would be impressed by this. And meanwhile, he would use his prime minister as a shield to deflect criticism. Well, Macron hasn't done that, and it's interesting to see that Edouard Philippe, the prime minister, who comes from the center-right political family, has a higher approval rating than Macron, and it's partly Macron's own fault that he has been too much of a micromanager, and thus he has been the leader, the government figure whose neck is on the line, so to speak. So anything that goes wrong, he gets blamed for. Whereas traditionally, that would be the fate of the prime minister. And when too many things went wrong, then the president would change the prime minister. Now we still may see that happen in France in the coming weeks and months, but one of the factors that may prevent or persuade Macron not to do that is that Edouard Philippe could be the next candidate against him in the presidential elections from the center right, and he would be a formidable opponent.
He's also an ex-young leader of the French American Foundation.
It shows you French American Foundation at the heart of power.
Now, it's time to turn it over to some questions, but I can't seem to pull up the questions. I keep pushing this Q&A button, but nothing happens. And Emmeline or Val, put the questions up on the board.
Sure. I'm happy to read the questions if both of you are all right with that. So our first one comes from Arlette. And it is, the dream of EU unity was a challenge but achievable when we were 15 member states. Now with 28 going towards 27, it is of course far more tenuous. Taking into account the dramatic impact of COVID-19, the reactions in member states to the brutal killing of George Floyd and the still nebulous scenario on Brexit, what is your assessment on Europe's resilience today compared to the one you expressed in 2017 in your book, Fractured Continent, following the forceful Franco-German financial initiative to meet the COVID-19 crisis?
Well, I think there are a lot of fissures still dividing Europe, as I wrote in my previous book, and in some cases they've become even more serious over the last few years, and certainly the pandemic, the post-pandemic era, will accentuate this challenge. It's going to really take bold leadership, and that means leaders are going to have to do things that may seem highly unpopular, but may be necessary if Europe is going to come out of this crisis. I mean, some countries have done well. Greece is something of a success story, that it has emerged from the debt crisis when it looked like it was going to fall apart. But it's also, and it had very few casualties during the pandemic, which their prime minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, attributed to an early lockdown and listening to the experts. But they could suffer a huge setback with the loss of tourism unless they can start opening up the economy. So it's really going to be a matter of whether Europe can succeed in opening up its economy in a safe way that does not drive back up the infection rate at a time when the virus is starting to spread through the Middle East and Africa. And I think this is something that haunts quite a number of leaders, including Macron. What would happen if, let's say, the pandemic spreads like wildfire across Africa and drives a lot of people from African nations trying to escape across the Mediterranean and immigrate to Europe? I mean, this is going to then, I think, fuel a rise in far-right populist anti-immigrant parties that could be dangerous politically for Europe. So there are these challenges out there on the horizon. It's hard to predict how they are going to play out, but it's going to require some bold and courageous leadership on the part of all the member states of the European Union.
Next question, Val.
Sure. So the next question comes from Christophe Labard. What would happen and change between our two countries if Joe Biden were elected?
Well, we're all here in Washington, D.C., we're all hanging on that question. I think this November election will be a hinge moment for the Atlantic Alliance. I think if Trump gets reelected for 4 more years, we could see the slow dissolution of NATO and the Atlantic Alliance. It's not inconceivable by any means. But if Biden gets elected, I think we will see a real effort to reinvent the Atlantic Alliance. I think, but it'll have to be on different terms. I think Europe is going to be asked to take greater responsibility for its own defense. I think it's hard to see how American voters will continue to be willing to spend money in defense of Europe and other wealthy areas, including our alliances in Asia, because we have so much work to do to repair our own economy. So this is going to have to, if Biden, as some of his advisors, whom I know have urged, want to create a new Atlantic charter, it's going to be difficult, first of all, to persuade our European allies to assume these greater responsibilities. And when America has always served as the last resort for its own security. But this, to his credit, I think Macron has been saying this for ever since he came into office, that this cannot be sustained. And I think the pandemic is going to drive this this division. And even somebody like Joe Biden, who throughout his political career has been extremely supportive of the Atlantic Partnership, is going to have a hard time convincing the American public that we need to continue to do so at a time when when America has so many other challenges.
Next question, Val.
Our next question is from Jean-Louis Gergorin. How do you perceive Macron's analysis and policy when confronted to the growing rift between the US and China?
Well, I think Macron, who's been going to China every year, had told me that he thinks the basis for a common Western strategy has to be reciprocity. In other words, the benefits that have been given to China have to be, and the openness we have shown in the West to allowing China's entry into our markets, and also in terms of investments, has to be reciprocated by China. And so far that hasn't happened. And if it doesn't happen, then we have to figure out a way to revise and redesign the global trading system. And I think given China's reluctance to make these changes, it's going to be more and more difficult, particularly as time moves on. When I mentioned that with the first one of the first meetings at the American during his state visit to the United States, Macron said he went in to see Trump in the Oval Office, and the first he had carefully rehearsed his pitch, and saying that we need to have a coherent strategy toward China, the United States and Europe. Working together, we will have enough leverage and enough power to make it felt. And then Trump interrupted him, said, "What do you mean? Europe is much worse than China." And then he went into a 2 or 3 minute rant about how German automobiles and the trade deficit and all of this. And Macron was left speechless because he thought this was going to be a convincing strategy that he would put forward to Trump, that Europe and the United States working together could be much more effective in persuading China to accept the reforms necessary to make it a more equitable trading relationship. But that hasn't happened, and how Europe and the United States will find a common strategic approach toward China will be one of the big tests of the Biden administration when it comes into office, if and when it comes into office in January of next year.
Next question, Val.
Our last question from the audience for now is from Jason El-Kubi, asking if you could provide an update on Macron's attempts at economic and labor reforms. Where do things stand and what's ahead? How have his attempts resonated in the rest of Europe?
Well, I think the pandemic has swept aside these reforms for the time being. I mean, this is the entire economic reform process is now focused on preserving jobs, keeping people employed. And I think, for example, even the reform of the pension system, which was very controversial, led to a lot of street protests, is probably not going to be revived anytime soon. So I think the events of the last 6 months, the way the pandemic has upended the world order and the priorities of every government in Europe and the United States, is is something that we need to see play out before we can anticipate him going back to the reform program. But to his credit, he's saying, look, we need to use this crisis as a way of redesigning our economy. Now, he's been criticized of being le président des riches, being too liberal and depending on free markets. If anything, the policies followed by the French government have been more socialist than even the socialists could have imagined in the wake of this pandemic. So I think what has been shown is that the strength of the state has really been the help France and other parts of Europe be more resilient than the United States, because we have such a dysfunctional political process, given the divisions between Congress and the presidency, that we haven't been able, first of all, in coping with the health consequences of the virus, and now dealing with the economic impact.
If there are no more questions, I have one. Let me read the last paragraph of your book. Whether Macron can restore momentum to the cause of a more integrated Europe that punches above its weight in the world remains uncertain. If he succeeds, he could infuse new life into Europe's ambition to serve as a shining beacon of democracy, freedom, and prosperity at a time when the authoritarian temptation is stronger than at any point since the 1930s. But if he fails, then Europe risks becoming irrelevant or worse, particularly if hate mongers and demagogues assume power and try to reverse policies designed to bring the continent closer together. In that event, Macron may have served tragically and reluctantly as the last president of Europe. Which leads me to the question of, should the title of your book ended with a question mark?
Well, I was trying to be provocative, and I'm willing to hear anybody argue with me. A question mark, in my view, and my editor's view, suggests that the author is uncertain of what he's trying to say.
Yeah.
And I wanted to make a strong pitch, because I feel strongly about Europe and about the transatlantic partnership. Since I'm married to a Belgian, and our children have both European and American passports. So I want to see this special relationship preserved well into the next generation. But I'm very fearful that unless leaders step up to the challenges that they're facing, and we saw what happened in the 1930s, that the failure to show leadership leads to tragic consequences.
Well, if there are no more questions, let me hold up the book, urge all of you who haven't gotten it to get it, and you will find that you will learn a lot. So thank you, Bill, for the book and for appearing on a French-American Foundation webinar.
It was my pleasure, Jim. Thank you so much for hosting me.
Well, I think this is a great place to end for today. On behalf of the foundation, thank you to Jim for moderating today, and for you, William, for sharing your insight and research into your book and President Macron's role from a global perspective. One final note before we close is just to announce our next webinar next Tuesday, the 23rd, in light of World Refugee Day this weekend, to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on migration in partnership with the organization Netakelam. So thank you again to both of you, to everyone online, and also to the Alliance Française of Chicago for helping us put this webinar together today. We hope to see you all very soon.